So everyone is coming in. Welcome to Pollinator Happy Hour, our second one. I am Christina, the Communications Coordinator for ADK Action, and I'm so excited that you're all able to join us. As we're all filtering in, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat using the text chat, and maybe share something about where you're from or how much your pollinator garden is going this year or how long you've been gardening. So everyone's still filtering in. As today we're going to be talking a little bit first, and then we're going to open up the floor to question and answer. So when you come up with questions, just feel free to type them in the chat and we'll be compiling them as we go along. We're being joined today by a guest. So especially if you have questions for her, get them in there early and we will be lobbing them at her a little bit later on. So let's see, just a little after 4 now. So we're gonna keep letting people in. As we're letting everyone in, I am gonna take a few moments to talk about our drinks because it is happy hour after all. So I'm going to talk about our drinks and a few pollinators. I know it's cold out today, but we wanted to celebrate some migrating pollinators that have spent the whole winter in Mexico and are on their way back up to us now. So here I have our mocktail. Then we're going to be sending out these recipes. This is in honor of the ruby-throated hummingbird, which is particularly attracted to the color red and sweet things. So we have here some local strawberries that have been frozen in my freezer since last spring, and I am clearing them out so that we are ready to pick more strawberries. We have some local maple syrup and some fresh mint, and just all of that with some water and blended together. And that is our hummingbird drink. And then our other favorite migratory pollinator was, of course, the monarch butterfly. And monarchs travel up to 3,000 miles and make a tremendous round trip migration, spanning generations. And many of them cluster in the Oyamel fir forests of Mexico, which is a high altitude fir forest. So in tribute to both their wintering lands in Mexico and the fact that milkweed, which many of us grow in our pollinator gardens, is what they require to become adult butterflies from caterpillar stage. I have made here a Oyamel Monarch. So this is some coconut milk. It has some fresh lime juice, a little bit of sugar for sweetness, and we have a little bit, tiny little splash of mezcal in a nod to the Mexican trip that many of our monarchs make. So those are our 2 highlighted drinks and pollinators, and I'm going to turn it over to Brittany now.
All right, thank you so much, Christina. She's making this so much fun for us here in the office. I've got these same drinks that she put together. And welcome to Pollinator Happy Hour, everyone. We had 111 participants register, and it looks like we're about 45 so far. So thank you all so much for carving out the time to learn about pollinators and to plan your pollinator gardens with us. The Adirondack Pollinator Project, I guess I should explain who I am because you don't all know me. My name is Brittany Christensen. I'm the Executive Director of ADK Action. I'm one of those lucky people that has their dream job. We at ADK Action have a whole slate of really fun projects. Everything from the Adirondack Pollinator Project to our Fair Food Pricing Project, which is focused on getting food from local farms to low-income individuals in our communities, to an incredible broadband project that one of our founding board members, Dave Wolf, runs, that's focused on helping people in the Adirondacks get access to broadband internet. We all know how important that is. And then we also work on reducing road salt, and we have a wonderful arts festival program. We work with several other organizations to put on arts festivals in the region. So all in all, we have nine active projects at the moment, and our mission is to create projects, innovative projects that promote vibrant communities and preserve the beauty of the Adirondacks for all. So we're very happy to be here and to present this happy hour with our partners. Back in 2016, ADK Action partnered up with the Wild Center, Lake Placid Land Conservancy, and Paul Smith College. And together, the four of our organizations launched the Adirondack Pollinator Project. And our goal is to create conditions where pollinators can thrive. And so all of you have a hand in doing it by creating pollinator gardens at your homes. I just want to take a moment and turn it over to our partners. We do have Leanne here today from the Wild Center. So Leanne, please tell everybody about your pollinator programs.
Yeah, thank you, Brittany, so much for having me here today. I'm so thrilled to be joining. So the Wild Center, if you're not familiar, we are a small natural history museum in Tupper Lake. We have a beautiful 115-acre campus, which we very strategically do not mow. There's one small section that we choose to that is primarily for small area programming outside, so we can all stand there. But otherwise, we have a wealth of pollinator gardens, which we are really proud of, to help bring monarch butterflies, bees, and all sorts of insects to our site to help them on their way and in their journey. We also, and I'm so thrilled that we just got some new bees in, we have several active beehives on our site, as well as indoors, which fingers crossed we can open back up here shortly and let everyone inside and see everyone face to face again. The virtual world has been great. We have live bees on our site as well. So you can watch an observation beehive, which I could literally stand there all day and watch them as they're going in and out and building their honeycomb. So I encourage, if you ever get an opportunity, watch an observation hive. It is a lot of fun. So those are two of the things that we really are passionate about, trying to keep our property as friendly to pollinators as possible and providing some great housing for bees and creating some honey. Not a ton, we mostly leave it to them, but conserving that habitat and educating and getting the youth really excited is really key to us at the Wild Center.
Awesome, thank you so much, Leanne. We also have Martha Vandervoort here from Paul Smith College. Martha, can you tell us about the Butterfly House and your other programs?
I would be happy to. Thank you, Brittany. Yeah, my name's Martha Vandervoort. I'm the program coordinator here at Paul Smith College Visitor Interpretive Center, locally known as the VIC. And we have a beautiful 3,000-acre property, all of which is native vegetation and much of which is pollinator friendly. But thanks to ADK Action, we increased our pollinator plants with the installation of a pollinator garden a couple of years ago, which is doing very well and complements the native habitat that we already have. Brittany mentioned our butterfly house, which is one of our favorite places. It's a very intimate structure that is simply a dome covered with a net, inside of which we rear native butterflies and moths. So we need to have the appropriate host plants inside the butterfly house to ensure that they have all of the food that they need to go through their life cycle. So it's a wonderful interpretive educational program that we're able to deliver every summer. We participate in the National Monarch Tagging Program. So we tag all of the adults that metamorphose from the caterpillars that we rear inside the house. And this is the last generation of the multi-generations that are moving north. So the adults that we're rearing here fly back to Mexico to partake in Christina's cocktails that she's prepared. So thank you, Brittany. Yep.
Great, thank you so much, Martha. And we also have some fantastic partners at Lake Placid Land Conservancy who weren't able to make it today, but just a plug for them because they do a great job with citizen science. They do iNaturalist trainings. So for those of you who maybe find yourself out walking in the forest and you see a beautiful flower and you don't know that flower's name, you can snap a photo on iNaturalist and you can identify that flower. And not only that, but you can help contribute to the body of scientific research on pollinators and their host plants by geotagging, saying, okay, this is the location where I found this flower. And that can be really helpful for scientists studying native plants. And maybe it's an invasive that you're admiring too. So that would be good to know. But anyway, Lake Placid Land Conservancy does incredible work around citizen science, and they also have a great program for landowners to conserve their land and also to plan their land for wildlife. They even do some wildlife cams that they install, so you can see who's visiting. Say you have woods behind your house, you can see who your visitors are in the woods. So definitely reach out to Lake Placid Land Conservancy. All right, so huge thanks to all of our partners. I also want to share that ADK Action and our partners over the past several years, we've given out over 70,000 packets of free native wildflower seeds. And so we can't know exactly if every single packet has been planted, but that translates to a huge, huge area of native wildflowers, and they're mostly perennials. So we hope that some of you have some of the flowers from the seeds we give away growing in your gardens. We also have a pollinator garden assistance program, and we are making an announcement later this week. On Friday, it should hit the news, our 10 gardens that we've selected this year. So we work with community sites, libraries, hospitals, schools, any kind of community site in the Adirondack Park to install beautiful pollinator gardens. So we're about to announce this year's cohort. And with this year's 10 gardens, we'll be up to 26 pollinator garden installs that we've helped through hands-on conservation this summer. All right, now I just want to remind everyone, we're going to be focusing on your questions today. We do have some great resources in terms of garden layouts and garden plans that we're going to send you after this call. But what we want to focus on today is our incredible expert and guest speaker, Kim Eierman. She's going to help answer questions about your garden. You know, what are you trying to do to plan your garden? What do you need to know? So we have worked with Kim a couple of times over the years. She came and provided talks for us in 2018, and she came back again for Pollinator Week last year and provided a digital lecture. So Kim, thank you so much for being here. We're happy to have you again.
Thank you.
Absolutely, and just a little bit on your background. So Kim Eierman is the founder of Eco Beneficial. If you haven't been to ecobeneficial.com, Christina will pop the link in the chat. Kim has incredible resources on her website. She's an environmental horticulturist and an ecological landscape designer. She specializes in native plants. Kim's based in New York City, and she teaches at the New York Botanical Gardens, the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, and the Native Plant Center. Kim is an active speaker nationwide on many landscaping topics, but she's constantly presenting at industry conferences and green events, master gardener groups, garden clubs, nature centers, etc. So Kim knows her stuff, to say the least. And if you go to her website and look at some of the video resources, she's interviewed some of the top names in pollinator conservation. So there's some great interviews and some great tutorials. So Kim, again, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. And I'm not quite in New York City. I'm really close. I'm 16 miles north of Grand Central Station. So I'm in the burbs, but barely. So if I can garden for pollinators, everybody can.
Wonderful. Yeah, great. So Christina, did you want to start with one of our polls before we get into the Q&A?
Yes, I would love to. So we came up with a few polls. So I'm just going to do this and it should pop up on your screen. And if you want to take a moment to answer, how long have you been gardening for pollinators? I'd be interested in knowing where everyone is at on this. I can see all the results coming in, and everyone else is just have to be in the dark until I end the poll. Okay, most of us have voted, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. We've got a pretty good spread here. We've got some people over 10 years, but the bulk of us have been doing 1 to 5 years, which is exactly what I have been doing. So probably a lot of us have some gardens and are looking to expand them or find out what's going wrong with them after 1 to 5 years as well. So I've got another poll that I'm going to do at this time because I really want to know. Let's see. what challenges you are all experiencing in your pollinator gardens. So you can select as many of these as you find applicable, because I know we all have multiple challenges going on, but what are the main challenges that you're facing in your pollinator garden?
Yeah, the deer are bad up here in the Adirondacks. They'll eat just about anything.
That is one of our biggest questions that we get, is about deer resistant pollinator plants. Although while we are waiting for this, because this one I want to make sure everyone gets their voice in there, I do see in the chat a question about what is the best way to add native grasses into their gardening. And I know that I've had that question before, and I do not have a good answer.
Like me to chime in?
If you have a good answer, I would love to hear it.
Well, it's tricky to do it after the fact, because, you know, having a clean palette is probably the best way to start off with native grasses. But if you're going to try to include them, you really do need to create a fairly large expanse, much larger than the plant that you're going to be planting, to give it room to grow. And of course, it depends on the species too. So you've got to decide whether you're going to be using clumping grasses that are a little bit easier to manage in a pollinator garden per se, a designed one, or if you're planting grasses that are going to be spreading, that's a whole nother story. So little blue stem, easier. Indian grass, a lot harder.
Okay, so we have the results of our challenges. So I hope everyone can see those. So it looks like the most of us are having problems designing a garden that looks good, followed by deer keep eating my plants and finding plants that will thrive on my land. So Brittany, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I have this exact same challenges. My husband and I built a new house. And so we have that new home construction yard going on where there's still a lot of gravel and a lot of bare soil. And we've been trying to make our pollinator garden look good. And it's challenging. Something that happens a lot with natives is, like, you don't realize how tall they are, and then suddenly you have this huge tall plant that, you know, that's in a part of your garden where you might want that more towards the back, for example. But Kim, you know, given that we're all trying to make a garden that looks good, can you give us a little just baseline, very basic advice for starting from scratch, for starting a new pollinator garden?
Sure. And of course, I'm thinking about aesthetics last. I know you're probably shocked to hear that, but really what I'm thinking about is, who are the pollinators that are visiting my garden already, or could be, you know, regional pollinators, and what is it that they need? And then how can I choose a plant palette that'll be successful in my planting site, having done a site analysis, by the way, guys, that's something you really need to do. And then I start to think about the aesthetics. So grouping plants is good for both us humans visually, but also it's great for pollinators. So some research out of the University of California, Berkeley Bee Lab found that a 1 square meter target of a particular species is ideal for quite a few pollinators. That can be hard to achieve in smaller landscapes. So what I suggest is you do smaller groupings and then repeat them throughout the landscape. But repetition is really, really helpful. And particularly when you're gardening in the front of your house where people see it, right? We might be a little bit more naturalistic in the back of the house, but grouping plants. So in my own garden, I had to redo my backyard garden last year because my railroad tie walls collapsed. It was not fun just before COVID. So I wound up, it looked like World War II bombing in my backyard. That was a blank slate. So I had to really think about, you know, how is this going to work? And you're right, picking plants that you know what the mature size is going to be is very helpful. But with natives, it can vary. I'm sure a lot of you have had that experience. You see, you know, a spice bush, it could be 4 feet or 9 feet, you know, tall. I go, oh my word, you know, what do I do with that? So there's a bit of a challenge there, but give them room. But I tend along, say, walkways particularly to repeat patterns of plants. So right now, along my walkway where I'm walking through my garden, I've got things like, I use regional natives and a few nearby natives too, but GM triflorum, prairie smoke, which is really short, spring blooming. I'm using pussy toes. I just saw an American painted lady butterfly laying her eggs on that short little pussy toes, big strip of that. I've got a Rigeron pulchellus, robin's plantain, which is also kind of short mast. So creating these like visual targets for me and the pollinators, and then working my way back from the edges, further away, starting to increase the heights and the textures of the plants is basically what I'm doing.
Oh, that's really helpful. And you just answered Sue's question. Sue asked if it was true that if, pollinators prefer large clusters of the same.
Yeah.
So you're right. It does look so much better when you have a bit of a cluster too.
I'm muted. So my question to you is, are we going to?
Okay.
Let me make just one comment about meadowscapes and erratic meadows, if I could. So some of us may want to go wild in part of our landscapes. If I had more land, I certainly would do that. And meadows typically have erratic patterns of flowers. Natural meadows go, you can see that the particular species will repeat, but it's random. And that really works for bees and butterflies, particularly because they have a behavior called floral constancy or floral fidelity, where on each foraging mission, and they may go out to eat, dozens of times a day, but on each mission, they're looking for the same species of plant. So that repetition of bloom kind of helps them out. So, you've got an alternative there too.
That's really helpful and fascinating. And in fact, Kim, you're making me think of the new cameras that can see essentially what pollinators can see on flowers.
Yeah, what we think they can see.
Right.
It's a bit of speculation.
Our best guess. But that's great. So we'll send out information following the call, but I think that those 3 points, floral fidelity, floral constancy, and then also that repetition of bloom, and that ties right into the clusters, and that's something that we want to focus on. And you spoke about it a little bit, but we have a question from Dale about reducing the amount of lawn.
Yay!
Grow. So that's awesome. Sometimes the thing about pollinator gardening is that doing less is doing more. So. He wants to know, he wants to grow more types of perennials that will spread and thrive. He has clay soil, and he's thinking about New England native asters. So do you have any suggestions for how he can go about this process?
Sure. So I'm all good with getting rid of some of the green desert. That's what I call lawn. It is an ecological wasteland for pollinators and most other creatures, and it does a lousy job at holding stormwater. So we need to really let go. So my suggestion is keep whatever green desert that you really use, your kids, you play on it, entertain on it, whatever, but manage the rest organically, right? So my book is dedicated to Rachel Carlson. So you probably know who Rachel Carlson was, right? Silent Spring. So I really believe that pesticides have no place in pollinator gardens. So you can start small if it's a little intimidating to you. I make a suggestion in my book about creating pollinator islands. Just go for it. Just find an expanse. You say, well, that looks like a good spot, particularly if you're in a sunny spot. 6+ hours of sun a day, you're going to have the most choices of pollinator plants. That's not to say you can't have pollinator gardens in shade. You can, but you have less of a plant palette to choose from. And think about, what shape makes sense. It doesn't have to be fancy dancy. It could just be an oval. It could be an asymmetrical shape, really up to you. But think about creating a large enough pollinator garden where you can get at least like a bare minimum of 3 species of flowering native perennials in that are going to bloom at any given time throughout the growing season. So we're thinking about early spring all the way through late fall. So asters are great, but that's going to be a late fall choice. We need to start thinking about some of the, early bloomers too. And if we're lucky enough to live in a wooded area where we've got some trees, a lot of those woody plants are going to provide early nectar and pollen for pollinators like red maples and pussy willows and so on. Even some wind pollinated plants, surprisingly, can provide some resources to pollinators. For example, like our American hazelnuts, low quality pollen, there's a lot of it, but it's there at a time of year when there's not a lot. But we can't rely upon wind pollinated plants to do the whole job, obviously. But thinking about that succession of bloom, and that's another term, a continuous succession of bloom from early spring through late fall, including native perennials, shrubs that are native, trees that are native, vines that are native, and so on. And if you get lucky, you might even score a few native annuals. One of my favorites is jewelweed. It's so awful that we call a lot of these beautiful things weeds, isn't it? But that's a fantastic native annual. And we have a number of them that you might be able to find that are garden worthy. So make a plan, think about, how big an area can I commit to, and what are the species that bloom, in the early spring, mid-spring, late spring, and so on, all the way through late fall. Think about having at least 3 different species per that time period that are going to be in bloom. Some will be much longer blooming than the others, as you've probably noticed. Like our fall sunflower has a really long bloom time. Our obedient plant has a really long bloom time. So that counts too. What I really suggest, and I insist on it with clients, is do a site analysis, right? So there's some good online resources about doing a site analysis, figuring out, first of all, how many hours of sun do you have per day, direct sun in a particular planting area? Don't fib, right? Getting a soil test done, really, really, really important to get that done, because you want to know what's your soil acidity, right? If you've got a really low pH, you're good to go with things like blueberries and plants that are in the heath family and so on. But if you've got a very alkaline soil, which is unlikely in the Adirondacks, but you might, particularly if you're in an urban setting or near roadways and stuff. But you want to know the pH. You want to know the soil texture. This fellow, he says, well, he's got clay. Well, you know that plants that like wet feet will do well with that. So that might lead you in the milkweed family to do swamp milkweed, but certainly not a butterfly weed that wants faster draining soil. So making these decisions of plants in context is really key. And do your research before you buy plants. I think that's very important. And I really suggest the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center native plant database. That's a really good one. And weirdly, Missouri Botanical Garden. I know that sounds crazy, but they have got some very good plant information. Sometimes they disagree with each other, but those are really 2 very good resources. And the other places that I would take a look, since we're in New York, there's the Flora Atlas of New York, the New York Flora Atlas. Anybody use that? You can take a look and see what's native to your county, which is kind of cool, or not native. And if anybody is out of state, probably not, but just in case, Biota, BIOTA of North America, and can give you that information in North America for every state, and into Canada by county for the US.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. We also developed a cheat sheet with some of the plants that we chose for this year's pollinator plant sale. And so we're going to send that out as a resource after the call. I know that we have several of you are from out of the area, but a lot of you, I think, have at least seasonal residences in the Adirondacks. So we can give you a cheat sheet there and all of the resources that Kim just mentioned.
Right.
And everything that you said about choosing plants and thinking ahead and planning was really helpful. Can you talk a little more about the mechanics of actually rewilding? So say you're doing a pollinator island, would you recommend rototilling the space? Would you put a border around it? Talk about that.
So, we've thought of our soil as being dirt for too long. Our soil is alive. I mean, it's thought that there are more organisms in a teaspoon of soil than there are human beings on the planet. So it's alive. And so when we slice it and dice it, we really do a lot of harm, both to those invertebrates, but also to the soil structure, removing the air pockets, the pores that are so important to healthy soil, and so on. So no, I'm a big proponent of sheet mulching, lasagna gardening to prepare a site, not tilling. with clients, a lot of people don't have patience. So, that is a reality, and you might not have patience. So if you're converting turf into a pollinator garden, dig up the turf, don't rototill it, but just dig up the turf. And then depending on what species you're planting, you might add some compost. Knowing your organic matter, the percentage of organic matter that you have in your soil is another component of doing a soil test. And some plants don't want a lot of organic matter. So that's a consideration too. No matter what soil you have, there are plants that will fit into that soil and thrive. What I really don't suggest is trying to dramatically change your soil. I think you should work with the soil that you have and improve the soil biology. And typically that means being very gentle with it and not digging it up too much. And it also means adding some compost, some active aerated compost from time to time.
Great, thank you, Kim. I'm really glad that you got into that element of the soil being alive. We have a new project at ADK Action, Compost for Good. And so we're focused on rebuilding soils. And it's really incredible how much carbon is sequestered in intact soils. So from a climate change perspective, that's really important. I want to get to some of the specific questions from the audience. Liz wants to know if you have recommendations for native plants that work well in patio gardens.
So by patio, I assume you mean in planters? Is that what we're talking about?
I think so.
Okay. Well, tons. Actually, I teach a class on great native plants for containers. I mean, there are a lot of plants that do quite well in containers. You just have to consider with some plants, they have very, very deep root systems, some native plants, particularly warm season native grasses. So you got to be a little gentle with that. I mean, if you've got a container that has a soil depth of 1 foot and you've got a plant that wants to have a 6 to 8 foot root system, it might not work out so well. But I routinely put native plants in containers. And, when I run out of room, it's perfect, right? Or if I've got something that I really want to have that I don't have the right soil conditions or sun conditions, get a planter. I'll give you an example. I really love Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower. It's a hummingbird favorite. I just don't have that part sun, really moist to almost wet soil that it craves. Poof, put it in a planter, position it, so it's in the right spot. Not full sun, but part sun's kind of best with a lot of moisture that you add, and you can have Lobelia cardinalis. But echinacea, is kind of a go-to plant in terms of containers. It's just such a long blooming plant that works really well in. I mean, I have everything from swamp milkweed, no kidding. It's a bit tall, 4 feet in a pot. It's okay, it works. And then I really don't have the room for straight species Joe Pye weed, but as I say, I'd rather have a dwarf Joe Pye weed cultivar than no Joe Pye weed at all. So I have Little Joe, which ain't that little. My Joe Pye weed is 4 to 5 feet tall. And that plant reseeds like a son of a gun. Does anybody have that plant? So I think I have Little Joe in every container on my patio because it's just landed there. The other one that does really well wherever you plant it, it seems, even though it in theory should be in a part sun condition, again with moist soil, is Lobelia syphilitica, gray blue Lobelia. That's a prolific reseeder. So now I'm trying to make that decision. Do I pull it out of all the containers that it's landed in, where all the seeds have gone, or do I just, kind of go with it? And I usually just say, oh, enjoy, go for it. Frost asters, which some people think of as weedy, which I think are fantastic plants because they're such late blooming plants. They've really come in strong this year in my containers. But I mean, you can grow goldenrods. I mean, you can grow all sorts of things in containers. Just do yourself the favor of getting larger containers, not little itty bitty ones, and really do pay attention to the depth, the soil depth. Deeper is better. Then in containers, we want a lighter soil that drains more easily. There's no air exchange with, the surrounding soil because you're in an enclosed container. So, think about using some materials, preferably sustainable ones that can lighten the soil a little bit. And including with some of these plants, like butterfly weed, a little bit of gravel or sand to help that drainage is a really great idea. But go for it. Heliopsis helianthoides, fall sunflower, probably probably a shorter one than the straight species, which can be huge. Penstemon hirsutus, one of my favorite penstemons, hairy penstemon, which isn't very tall at all. It's about 1.5 feet. There's tons and tons of things you can do in a container.
Thank you so much, Kim. And for anyone who was like, I don't want to lose any of this info, but I can't keep up. We are recording this, so we'll send out the recording and we're taking good notes. So we've got your back, so you can just try to absorb what you can. You're such a powerhouse of knowledge. Thank you. We have another question from Lynn. Lynn wants to know if you could plant one or two native plants, if we could plant just one or two native plants at our camp near Gore Mountain. It basically has woods with a border garden and a sunny gravel driveway. What plants should we choose? We already have ferns, milkweed, and black-eyed Susan.
One or two?
Yeah.
Ugh. Lordy. Well, see, that kind of flies in the face of having that sequence of bloom, right? So we got to loosen up a little bit. We're going to have to find some more planting areas. Woodland gardens, I think, don't get their due because there are so many fantastic woodland plants. And you guys, where you are, I'm downstate New York, but where you are, if the deer haven't eaten them, you have some really incredible spring ephemerals. These are the plants that come out early in the spring before the leaves leaf out on the trees when conditions are, not too warm yet. And typically the weather is a bit on the moist side. So these plants come up like Dutchman's breeches would be one, Dicentra cucullaria. And they're just inches tall. They're, well under 1 foot tall, and they bloom at a time when some of our overwintering bumblebees are emerging because they tend to come out a little bit earlier than some of our other species of bees, and they need that resource to feed on. So those spring ephemerals, like the trout lilies, for example, I mean, there are so many different ones that you probably have a hard time finding. Claytonia virginica, spring beauties. Maybe you'll have an easier time where you are. I've spent quite a bit of time in the early spring trying to source these things. And it's been a challenge, but I found some. Even the one of the earliest bloomers are the hepaticas. These are wonderful plants. And so, your woodland garden tends to be showier, in the spring, right? Your full sun pollinator gardens tend to, come on strong in the summer. So now that we're moving into May, I'm seeing geranium maculatum, wild geranium. Again, I'm warmer than you guys are, so you're probably not getting these guys yet. I'm seeing Jacob's ladder in bloom. I'm seeing the native woodland phlox, both Phlox arcata and Phlox stolonifera that are in bloom. And, and we keep going from there. So I can't really give you one or two because if you think about it, we have all these different types of pollinators. We have bees, we have butterflies, we have wasps that are providing pollination services. We have some species of flies that pollinate, right? We have birds that do pollination services and beetles and so on. And they all have evolved with suites of floral traits that they're particularly attracted to and favor. So if we think about each category of pollinators, we can start making choices for all of them. And, we have so many species. We have over 400 species of native bees in New York, and they're not all the same size, shape, body configuration, tongue length, et cetera. So they're going to have different needs too. All right. I see there's a poll up.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue.
I had to. I want to know what people are trying to attract to their garden.
I was skeptical about whether anyone would select parasitic wasps, but 4 of you,
yeah,
you're surprising
yeah.
us. That's great.
Yeah.
You must know about their ability to help scare away and fight off the pests in the garden. While we get the rest of the results there, we did have a question specifically about attracting mason bees. Suzanne from Philadelphia wants to encourage mason bees. Do you have any strategies?
So, their nesting is quite particular, and there is a wonderful book on alternative pollinators. And if you remind me, I'll give you that information so you can send it along, because some people, quote unquote, keep mason bees, right? So habitat is really the key. And, we're talking a lot about floral resources, but we have to remember a couple of facts about pollinators, right? They not only need things to eat, they need places to live. They need habitat. And we can do a lot to provide habitat in our landscapes. Native bees, 70% are ground nesters, 30% are cavity nesters. And we need to provide places for both types. But again, 90% of native bees are solitary. So that's a lot of habitat. Butterflies, in terms of encouraging them, well, I mean, I don't know if you want me to go through this, but, you know, I see that 95% want butterflies, which is funny because this is what we used to call pollinator gardens. We called them butterfly gardens because people are afraid of bees for a long time, right? We've gotten bolder now, but providing basking sites, providing, they don't nest, the butterfly houses don't work. So don't bother with that. But a lot of these butterflies in both a larval stage and an adult stage may be in leaf litter over the winter. So keeping our leaves in place would be very important. And when they're adults, they like to rest on trees, on limbs of shrubs, etc. And they like to bask in sun to warm their bodies up so they can get warm enough to go to nectar. So, you know, got to have host plants, larval host plants for butterflies too. And that's a whole nother category. Thinking about both wind pollinated and animal pollinated plants. You know, probably most of you know about Dr. Doug Tallamy's work, Bringing Nature Home being his first book. And of course, oaks are, you know, top of the heap in terms of supporting the most number of moth and butterfly caterpillars. And then we see prunus, the cherries and the plums and salix, the willows and so on. And just go down that list. So I'm answering at least 2 questions at once, but go ahead.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So
Sure.
in addition to butterflies, people also really want to attract native bees and hummingbirds.
Yeah. So hummingbirds, I mean, you know, they're migratory, right? So I think that we can act at home and we can advocate and contribute long distance. So really, you know, supporting habitats for things like monarchs and hummingbirds in the countries where they're going to, and the places that they're overwintering is really important. It's as important as what we do in our own landscapes. But with hummingbirds, one of our first blooming plants that they're going to be going to is Canada columbine, right? Aquilegia canadensis. And that's kind of an easy peasy plant to grow, part shade, part sun, not great soil, likes it on the rocky side. You know, I had some pre-existing columbine in my landscape, and after it all got dug up, I figured there were seeds in the seed bank, but I had no idea the columbine would pop up in all sorts of places where I didn't plant it, right, from previous times. And so I just decided, you know what, fine. It's not the design I created, but the hummingbirds will use it, so let's go for it. But thinking about red tubular flowers in particular for hummingbirds, this is what I was talking about, these suites of floral traits, these pollinator syndromes that exist between plants and pollinators. And so they're particularly fond of these red tubular flowers, things like, you know, Monarda didyma, scarlet bee balm, and Lobelia cardinalis, that cardinal flower. But they'll go to other plants too. Penstemons are a particular favorite. They're not red. But you know, they're available at a time of year when hummingbird pollinators are looking for them. And that jewelweed I mentioned is a hummingbird favorite. So.
Oh, that's great. That's super helpful. We had our pollinator benefit dinner 2 years ago. We're hoping to bring that back post-COVID. Such a fun event. But at our pollinator benefit dinner, I was wearing a red dress. And while I was speaking, a pollinator came over, or a hummingbird came right up to me. And I've never been happier. It was so cool. I can attest, they do like red.
Yeah.
And let's see, we've got some questions here that are specific to sourcing plants. So Beverly wants to know about neonics. She says that when she goes to the nursery to ask if they have neonicotinoid-free plants, oftentimes the nursery worker or owner says, I don't know.
Yeah.
How do you handle that situation? How do you source plants that you know don't have neonicotinoids? And can you, for anyone who's unfamiliar, can you just explain what neonics are?
So it's a type of pesticide. It's a systemic pesticide, and it's often sublethal to bees, but weakens them significantly, and commonly used in plant growing. There are all sorts of bad things that are used in growing plants. And so what do you do with that? Well, consider the fact that your garden center or wherever your retail place you're going to shop for plants, they probably have absolutely no clue how these plants are grown. They arrive in the trucks, they're unloaded, and boom, they are. So I really like to buy plants whenever possible from local growers who are native plant specialists who are growing from seed. And that's an enormous amount of work and requires an enormous amount of dedication. And I think it deserves paying more for those plants. It's the provenance, it's the quality of the plant. It's kind of the same deal if you go to a farmer's market and you're buying organic, locally grown food. You're willing to pay more for it than going to Costco and saying buying conventional tomatoes or whatever. So there are not that many nurseries that we can go to that do this, but there's some. And I'm just wondering, I'm trying to recall, is Amanda's Garden anywhere near you guys?
I don't believe so.
No, okay, but
Fiddlehead Creek Nursery was in Boat Landing for a while, but they stopped selling to the public, unfortunately. This very question is why we started our native plant sale action, because people were having such a hard time with sourcing. So Christian at Cook and Gardner was our special guest at our last Pollinator Happy Hour. He grows a lot from seed. He also works with North Creek Nurseries in Pennsylvania, and they have really great growing practices there, and they do mail order.
They do, but they do use some pesticides. They are not organic, and there really isn't an accepted organic certification for growing plants, which is unfortunate, and we need to change that. It's not the same as buying food. So I think that's something that really does need to change. So, buying, knowing where your plants come from and how they were grown is super important, but it's a challenge. And when you're buying from, other vendors in other parts of the country, then you're also thinking about plant genetics and if the plants are appropriate to the region that you're in. So the Wild Maine Seed Project, anybody ever heard of that? So they're growing local ecotype plants in Maine that are appropriate for ecoregions that are further down in the Northeast. But that kind of effort, I think we need to see more of. But native plant nurseries, if they're growing their own, you're typically ahead of the game, and especially because you're going to be getting genetically different plants too, which is a huge part of battling climate change, having biodiversity and genetic diversity. And so, this becomes challenging. I mean, for me as a designer working with clients, people want the stuff that they know is working, right? So here's an example. There's a plant called Phlox paniculata, tall garden phlox. There are a lot of cultivars of it. So the Mount Cuba Center in Hoggaston, Delaware does these plant trials. You can actually download. And they did a plant trial on phlox, and they found that the cultivar named Gina, Jeana, attracted 4 times the number of butterflies than the next cultivar down. Well, here's the problem. They're genetic clones. That's how they're grown. And most of the cultivars that we buy are genetic clones. There's no genetic diversity. So if a disease or a pest hits that plant, we all have the same plant, bad things happen. So really thinking more about buying straight species plants whenever possible and locally grown plants that are appropriate to your region is really best practice.
Can you just explain for anyone who isn't familiar what a straight species plant is?
Sure. So kind of how they exist in nature, right? Without man intervening. So if you're looking at, I don't know, Penstemon digitalis, beard tongue, a common beard tongue, there's a grower here in my region in Connecticut that's hired botanists to go out and wild collect seed. This year they wild collected from, I think, 37 different species that were just naturally occurring. Wild collected the seed, and then they're growing this seed out as plugs and selling them through a conservation organization. So that's straight species. That's grown from seed. Man hasn't intervened and mixed and matched and selected for particular traits. But a cultivar has been selected for a particular trait. And it could be height, could be color of the leaf, it could be color of the flower, it could be disease resistance. It could be all sorts of things. And sometimes it makes sense. Like I just mentioned, I'd rather have a dwarf Joe Pyeweed cultivar than no Joe Pyeweed at all, because they're really big. They're 6 to 8 feet tall, and I can't get a big one in my garden. But some cultivars perform better than others, ecologically speaking, in terms of attracting pollinators, being larval host plants, and so on. And some of them are just darn near useless. Particularly ones that have been selected or bred to have double petals, double flowered forms. So coneflower is a classic example. If we see coneflower, it's got a cone. That's where the nectar and the pollen is. That's where the seed will form for birds. And if we choose a coneflower where there is no cone, it's just a lot more petals, then essentially most, if not all, of the nectar and pollen has been bred out. And what may be remaining is inaccessible to the pollinator. So cultivated selections, cultivars, AKA nativars, most of them are grown as clones. Most of them are not grown from seed. There are some rare exceptions, but most of them are grown from a vegetative cutting or tissue culture. They're grown asexually. They're not grown from seed. And clones are not good for the environment as a general rule. We really want the genetic diversity that is so lacking, in the world now.
Great, thank you so much for that. We saw earlier in the poll that a lot of folks are worried about deer pressure in their garden. We had an interesting suggestion from one of the participants. She uses a scarecrow sprinkler. So I just wanted to call that out if anyone didn't see that. Kim, do you have any experience with the scarecrow speaker?
Scarecrow speaker? Yeah,
sprinkler,
sprinkler, okay. I know that they exist. They're like motion sensitive things that, flash lights or make noise or whatever. I mean, I think like you do whatever you possibly can without driving yourself crazy. But this is a huge environmental problem. Between deer and invasive plants, and they are very much connected, we really have an extreme challenge to our environment. Down here, I mean, you would be stunned if you've ever been to Lower Westchester. You would not believe the landscapes, these little tiny landscapes where you think there's no way deer would come here. And guess what? They're coming from a local wooded area and eating, folks' flowers with abandon. They're everywhere. So what do we do about it? Well, I think, first of all, we have to advocate realistically for deer management on a municipal level, on a state level, on a federal level. I think this is not just the purview of the homeowner. When we're planting, just to use deer-resistant plants is kind of a tragedy because we're losing those evolutionary connections that exist with so many species of plants and wildlife, right? So if we just use deer-resistant plants, we've lost a lot in our ecosystems. So there isn't an easy answer. Do you deer exclude? Well, that has its negatives. If you deer exclude with fencing, then you want to make sure that you're not, negatively impacting other creatures. I mean, it's a really complex question, but, meadows and meadowscapes are that are erratically designed. So with a repetition of bloom, but not, a huge targeted deer buffet. That's one way to approach this. Because you're going to have less deer browse and more of a prayer that they, don't eat every single one of a particular plant. Using plants that deer don't like around ones that they particularly love, like, our mountain mints, they don't like at all. And it's, great idea to use those around ones that they might prefer. But it's a challenge. And I'll be honest with you, I've been doing this work for a while and I've never seen deer pressure this bad. Deer eating, at least in the tri-state area, where I am downstate, New York and New Jersey and Connecticut, I'm seeing deer browse on things that I never saw deer browse on before. So protecting plants early in the season is probably not a bad idea. Baptisia australis, a nearby native, false blue indigo, used to be, absolutely deer proof. No, when it's young, it's just coming up, boop. One browse and it's bitten off already. So I think you have to really pay attention to where the deer are nibbling and use different strategies. I actually also suggest using what farmers use as a trap crop, planting some things that deer really, really love in areas of your landscape. If you have that ability, they love jewelweed. Plant, get a lot of jewelweed seed, try it. There are a lot of plants like that deer are very compelled by, and deer aren't the only ones, like groundhogs. Groundhogs love fleabanes. love them, love them. So instead of beating back all those annual flea banes that I tell clients to keep in their gardens, leave them or plant them in an area where the groundhogs can have a field day instead of, in your more designed, maintained garden.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much, Kim. Someone was asking about bats. Kathy said she never thought of gardening as a mean of attracting bats. How does that work? And are the bats that we have in our area pollinators?
No. So, we only have a select few of species of bats in North America that are pollinating bats. There are 3. And they're primarily in the Southwest, parts of Southern California too. So they're not here. Which is kind of sad because that'd be cool. But bats are important creatures and we can still support them primarily by not using pesticides. Bat houses can be a hit or miss affair. Build a bat house. I mean, it's worth a try, right? I mean, I think it's, always worth a try to see if you can help them. But no pollinating bats in this part of the country. In the Southwest, they're really important pollinators of things like the saguaro cactus, the Oregon pipe cactus, agave plant, and so on.
Kim, I have a quick follow-up question. If I love having bats around because I hate mosquitoes, are there any plants that encourage insects to visit my garden at night? And could that bring more bats to my yard, even if they're not pollinators?
You're trapping them for the bats. Yeah, so, plants that bloom or deliver nectar at night would be important. So our evening primroses would be classic examples. And interestingly, an organization I'll mention, you can plop that in the information too, is the Xerces Society, XERCES, which is a really important organization. It's a nonprofit. It's been likened to the Audubon Society, but for invertebrates. So they've got lots of good resources. They got a good pollinator habitat sign. You want to get up in your garden, plant lists, all sorts of good stuff. And anyway, they did a study on milkweeds some years ago, and they found that common milkweed, Asclepias syriaca, right? Common milkweed delivers nectar, not just during the day, but at night. So not all flowers do that. So a plant that delivers nectar at night has particular value to moths, especially that are active, right, at night. They'll become a meal for your bats. But yeah, we do have some plants that do that. There's not a lot of research about that particular information about nocturnal nectar delivery. I hope there'll be more information that does come out.
Great. Well, I think Brittany might be getting to one more question, but while she does, I'm going to launch one more poll because you have generously donated a copy of your latest book. So in this poll, if you're interested in being, beautiful.
There it is.
So click.
It fades out with a virtual thing.
Yes. I had trouble holding my drink in front of me before. It's the same problem. So if we'll pick someone who says yes at random at the end of the call, and we will get in touch with you via email about getting the book to you. So, so I'll turn it back over to Brittany for, I think, maybe one more question.
On my end, I think I've got through all the questions. Do you see one that I'm missing, Christina? Maybe we got
we might have gotten to all of them.
Perfect. Imagine that we would get all of your questions answered in an hour. Michael, did I see you raise your hand? Did you have a question?
Can you guys hear me? I asked one that wasn't answered, which was about with the deer deterrent. Is it okay, like spray deterrents, like liquid fence or deer off? Are they bad for pollinators because they keep the deer away, but are we creating another problem by using them?
So some pollinators do use scent as one of their cues to finding flowers, like bees do. Birds, not so much, right? So it kind of depends on the pollinator, but I particularly worry about host plants and spraying, something as capsicum, like a hot pepper spray, this kind of thing, or, stinky egg spray. So I asked the master of Lepidoptera, right, Dr. Doug Tallamy, the author of Bringing Nature Home and other wonderful books. I said, do you think this deer repellent actually deters caterpillar feeding? And he says, I really don't know, but I'll bet you it probably does. So Yeah, probably is the case. So if you're using a deer repellent, keep it away from the flower parts. It's a little tricky, right? But try to consider, those interactions. And then, even the larval host situation, it's really hard to spray a plant and not get the leaves. I get that, but do the best as you can.
All right. Thank you for that last question, Kathy. And I just want to thank everyone here. Thanks for joining us for our second of 3 pollinator happy hours. Kim, it's been wonderful to have you here.
Thank you.
Made this so much fun, and I think we all learned a lot. We're going to get to work here in the ADK Action offices, compiling all these resources. So we're going to package them and send them out to you. And Christina, can we announce the winner of the book drawing now, or do we need to do that in an email?
I think we need to do it in an email.
Okay. Oh, I wanted to have
Although nobody said no, thank you. So
yeah, they're not getting a book if they said no.
We'll do a random number generator right after the meeting, and keep everyone check your email.
Yep. Beautiful. Okay, so please join us for our third of 3 pollinator happy hours next month, June 4th from 4 to 5 p.m. And we hope to see you all there. Thanks again and have a great night.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.